Hey everyone. Today's story is about queens and the women who weren't queens but who somehow often had more influence than them. Yes, the royal mistresses. Those inconvenient but utterly fascinating women who shaped dynasties, redirected wars, and occasionally bankrupted entire treasuries. All while technically not being anyone important at all. Of course, that's the irony. They weren't supposed to matter. They were supposed to be temporary amusements, little diversions for bored monarchs. But the history books show us that mistresses often pulled more strings than the crowned wives themselves, which is awkward, especially when the queen had been chosen in a blaze of diplomatic contracts, ceremonies, and expectations, only to find her husband handing policy over to someone who technically wasn't even supposed to be in the palace. So let's drift through some of their lives, one by one. No rush, no urgency, just the gentle unraveling of dynasties, courtesy of women who happened to catch a king's eye. We'll begin in France because France perfected the art of the royal mistress. They even gave her a job title, maîtresse en titre, literally chief mistress, which is delightfully bureaucratic, really. A mistress wasn't just a fling. She could be a kind of semi-official member of the royal household. Sometimes she had apartments at court. Sometimes she controlled who got access to the king. Occasionally she got her own chapel, staff, and naturally a personal fortune. One of the earliest and most infamous was Agnès Sorel, mistress of Charles VII. In the 15th century, Charles himself wasn't especially remarkable, though he did manage to reclaim France after the long disaster of the 100 Years' War. But Agnès was memorable. She was described as the most beautiful woman in the kingdom, which was probably true, but also the kind of compliment that gets repeated whether it's true or not. She was known for her bold fashion choices. For example, she is credited with popularizing gowns that left one breast exposed. Yes, exposed. At court, at banquets, at religious ceremonies. Because of course she was. This caused quite a stir, as you can imagine, but Charles adored her. He piled her with jewels, estates, and gifts, while his poor queen, Marie of Anjou, quietly endured in the background, producing 11 children and being largely ignored. Agnès, meanwhile, wasn't just ornamental. She gave Charles political advice. She advocated for reforms, and she became a public symbol of France's revival. People grumbled, but they also noticed that the king suddenly seemed more competent while she was around. When Agnès died suddenly, in her 20s, possibly poisoned, Charles was devastated. His government stumbled, and rumors swirled for centuries about her mysterious end. So in that case, the mistress wasn't just more powerful than the queen, she was more beloved. Which must have been a bit awkward for Marie of Anjou, who lived to the ripe age of 59, quietly widowed and forgotten. If Agnès was the prototype, then Madame de Pompadour was the perfection. She became the official mistress of Louis XV in the 18th century, and unlike many of her predecessors, she managed to keep her position for almost 2 decades. Not bad, considering Louis was known for having the attention span of a bored teenager. At a summer job, Pompadour was clever. She realized that a mistress's real power wasn't in the bedroom. It was in the council chamber, the salon, and the art gallery. She made herself indispensable by controlling access to the king. Courtiers quickly learned that if you wanted Louis to hear your petition, it was much better to approach Madame first. She became a gatekeeper. She also had exquisite taste and basically redesigned the French court. Rococo art, the pastel, swirling decorative style that defines 18th century France. That's Pompadour. She set fashion trends, encouraged literature, and sponsored philosophers like Voltaire. Queens were not supposed to do that. Mistresses apparently could. But here's the strange part. Pompadour eventually lost the king's romantic interest. And yet, she stayed. She reinvented herself as his best friend and confidant, arranging new mistresses for him while keeping her place as chief advisor. It was a bizarre arrangement, but it worked. By the time she died, she had outlasted many of her rivals and was remembered more fondly than the actual queen, Marie Leschinska, who by then had retreated into pious obscurity. It's hard not to notice the pattern here. The queen was officially crowned, officially married, officially powerful, and yet she spent her life sidelined. Meanwhile, a mistress, who held no legal status at all, could dictate the aesthetics of an era. History, as always, has a sense of irony. Let's wander over to England for a while, because the English court had its share of mistress-driven politics too. The most famous, or infamous, was probably Barbara Palmer, Countess of Castlemaine, mistress of Charles II. Charles himself was an exuberant monarch, full of wit, charm, and questionable decision-making. He had dozens of mistresses, but Barbara was the first great favourite. Barbara was known for her temper, her extravagance, and her complete refusal to be discreet. She demanded titles, lands, and money. She insulted the Queen, Catherine of Braganza, to her face. She filled the court with her relatives, and she had 6 children by the king, all of whom were showered with noble titles. Naturally, she made enemies everywhere. Samuel Pepys, the diarist, wrote about her constantly, often with a tone of exhausted disbelief. But Charles put up with her antics because he wanted to. And because she understood that influence meant more than affection. Even after their romance cooled, Barbara kept a certain degree of power, though she eventually gave way to other favourites like Nell Gwynn, who, in contrast, was witty, light-hearted, and popular with the public. Nell famously reassured crowds shouting at her carriage, saying, "Pray, good people, be civil. I am a Protestant whore," which was, admittedly, a clever bit of branding in Restoration England. The Queen, poor Catherine, endured all of this with resigned patience. She suffered multiple miscarriages and never produced an heir, while mistresses around her raised entire broods of semi-royal children. Catherine remained queen consort in title, but it was Barbara, Nell, and the others who defined Charles's reign. If mistresses were powerful in England and France, in Spain they were controversial, to say the least. Spanish monarchs were supposed to be paragons of Catholic piety, which did not stop them, of course, from having mistresses, but it did mean the arrangement was often scandalous and politically volatile. Take Maria Calderón, known as La Calderona, mistress of Philip Thorp of Spain, in the 17th century. She was originally an actress, which already raised eyebrows since actresses were considered morally suspect. Philip adored her and had several children with her, including Don Juan José of Austria, who would grow up to be an influential military leader. But the affair became such a scandal that Calderón was eventually sent to a convent, which, as far as solutions go, was fairly standard in Catholic courts. Too troublesome? Pack them off to a nunnery. The Queen, Elizabeth of France, meanwhile, was kept at arm's length. She dutifully bore children, but her role was limited. The mistress, even when officially banished, left a much bigger mark on politics simply because her son would later challenge the king's favourites. So again, the mistress lingered in history. The Queen quietly disappeared. Mistresses could even influence entire wars. During the War of the Austrian Succession, for example, Madame de Pompadour's friendship with Austria's Empress Maria Theresa helped cement the alliance between France and Austria, the so-called diplomatic revolution. Imagine being a queen and realizing your husband's lover was now deciding the foreign policy of Europe. Uncomfortable, to say the least, and this was not unusual. Mistresses arranged marriages, negotiated treaties, recommended generals, and handed out lucrative court positions. In many ways, they acted like prime ministers with prettier gowns. Now you might wonder why queens tolerated this. Why didn't they resist? The answer is simple. They couldn't. Queens were political pawns. Most were foreign princesses shipped off to a strange land, married to a stranger, and expected to produce heirs. If they failed, if they had no children, or if their children died, their usefulness dropped to almost nothing. They had no independent power base, no wealth of their own, and no ability to leave. A mistress, however, could come and go. She could be dismissed, or she could outlast entire governments. It's one of those ironies that keeps surfacing in history. The person with the crown had less power than the person with no title at all. The Queen sits in her chambers sewing or praying. The king is with his mistress discussing politics, laughing at jokes, planning wars. The Queen has the crown, the mistress has the influence, and history remembers them both, though usually It remembers the mistress with more color.